The red button pulsed like a heartbeat on her computer screen, and Arya Sage knew that pressing it would change everything. The anonymous email had arrived 3 days ago with a simple message. Would you hurt a stranger for money? Click to find out. She deleted it twice, but somehow it kept reappearing in her inbox like a digital ghost that refused to be exorcised. Arya stared at her reflection in the black monitor, seeing a 28-year-old woman whose life had become a series of compromises and quiet desperations. Her marketing job barely covered rent in her cramped Seattle apartment, and the medical bills from her mother's cancer treatment had drained every savings account she'd ever managed to build. The fluorescent kitchen light flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows across her tired face as she sat hunched over her laptop at 2 a.m. Unable to sleep for the third night running, the button seemed to mock her hesitation. Below it, white text explained the rules with clinical precision. Participate in a psychological study on moral decision-making. Complete 5 tasks over 5 days. Each task pays progressively more money. $50,000. The number blazed in her mind like a neon sign. It was exactly what she needed to pay off her mother's remaining medical debt and maybe, just maybe, have enough left over to quit her soul-crushing job and pursue the photography career she'd abandoned years ago when reality came knocking. Her camera bag sat in the corner of her bedroom, gathering dust like an abandoned dream. Arya's fingers hovered over the trackpad. She'd always considered herself a good person, someone who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and donated to charity when she could spare a few dollars. But desperation had a way of redefining moral boundaries, and she found herself wondering what she might be willing to do for the kind of money that could transform her life overnight. The apartment building groaned around her, filled with the sounds of other people's lives bleeding through thin walls. Mrs. Chen upstairs was arguing with someone on the phone in rapid Mandarin. The college students next door were playing music too loud, the bass thumping through the walls like an irregular pulse. Everyone seemed to have somewhere to be, something to do, someone to talk to. Arya felt invisible in the middle of it all, a ghost haunting her own existence. She thought about her mother, sleeping fitfully in the hospice care facility 40 minutes away. Eleanor Sage had worked 3 jobs to put Arya through college, sacrificing her own dreams so her daughter could have better opportunities. Now Eleanor was dying, and the treatments that might extend her life came with price tags that made Arya's modest salary look like pocket change. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman who'd given her everything was now the reason she was considering something that violated everything she'd been taught. The cursor blinked expectantly over the red button. Arya closed her eyes and tried to imagine what kind of tasks the study might involve. Psychological experiments usually dealt with memory, perception, decision-making under pressure. How bad could it really be? She'd participated in university studies during college, earning beer money by answering surveys and performing simple cognitive tests. This couldn't be much different, despite the unusual recruitment method and a substantial payment. Her phone buzzed with a text from her boss, reminding her about the morning presentation she'd been dreading for weeks. The corporate world felt like a slow-motion suffocation, each day blending into the next in an endless cycle of meaningless meetings and arbitrary deadlines. She thought about the faces of her coworkers, people who seemed content to trade their lives for steady paychecks and dental benefits. Was that really so different from whatever this button might offer? Arya opened her eyes and looked at the screen one more time. The red button seemed larger now, more insistent. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized she'd already made her decision somewhere in the depths of her desperate subconscious. Her finger moved toward the trackpad with the inevitability of a falling stone. The click echoed through her quiet apartment like a gunshot. The screen flickered and changed, displaying a new message. "Welcome to the Empathy Project, Arya. Your first task will arrive tomorrow at midnight. Thank you for your participation. Remember, you can withdraw at any time, but completed tasks cannot be undone." The computer knew her name. Somehow, despite all the promises of anonymity, they knew exactly who she was. Arya stared at the screen until it went black, her reflection returning to show a woman who was no longer quite the same person who had been sitting there moments before. She'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and tomorrow would bring the first real test of who she was willing to become. The message arrived at exactly midnight, punctual as death. Arya had been lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rain paint patterns against her window, when her laptop chimed with the distinctive sound of an incoming email. She'd changed her notification settings dozens of times over the past 24 hours, but somehow the Empathy Project's messages bypassed every filter and security measure she'd put in place. Task 1, The Stranger's Pain, read the subject line. Arya's stomach clenched as she opened the email with trembling fingers. The interface had transformed overnight into something more sophisticated, more invasive. A live video feed occupied the center of her screen, showing a middle-aged man sitting alone in what appeared to be a sterile white room. He was reading a book, occasionally sipping from a coffee cup, completely unaware that his life was being broadcast to strangers. The instructions appeared in cold, clinical text below the video. This is David Chen, age 42, father of 2 daughters, recently divorced. He has volunteered for a pain tolerance study and has been informed he may experience mild discomfort. Your task is simple. Press the button when prompted, and David will receive a harmless but unpleasant electric shock. Duration, 5 seconds. Intensity, equivalent to touching a doorknob after walking on carpet. Compensation for task completion, $100. You have 5 minutes to decide. Arya's hands flew away from the keyboard as if it had burst into flames. This wasn't a psychological survey about moral decision-making. This was asking her to directly cause pain to another human being. The man on the screen looked kind, the type of father who probably helped his daughters with homework and attended their soccer games religiously. His eyes held the gentle sadness of someone recovering from life's disappointments, trying to rebuild and move forward. She tried to close the browser, but the interface wouldn't respond to her commands. The video remained fixed on her screen, unavoidable and insistent. A countdown timer appeared in the corner, 4 minutes and 37 seconds. David turned a page in his book, completely absorbed in whatever story was carrying him away from his own troubles. He had no idea that a stranger was wrestling with the decision to cause him pain. Arya's mind raced through justifications and rationalizations. The shock was described as harmless, barely more than static electricity. David had volunteered for a pain study, so he was expecting some level of discomfort. The money would help her mother, could literally save Eleanor's life by funding treatments the insurance company had deemed experimental. Surely causing minor, temporary pain to help save a life was morally defensible? But even as she constructed these arguments, a deeper part of her recoiled at what she was being asked to do. This was a human being with thoughts and feelings and fears, not a laboratory rat or a theoretical ethical dilemma. The very fact that she was considering it revealed something about herself that she didn't want to acknowledge, a capacity for causing harm that she'd never fully recognized. The timer ticked down mercilessly. 3 minutes remaining. David looked up from his book and smiled at something off camera, probably a researcher or technician. His smile was warm and genuine, the kind that reached his eyes and made him look years younger. Arya wondered what his daughters looked like, whether they had inherited that same easy warmth. She imagined them waiting for their father to come home from whatever study he thought he was participating in, trusting that the adults in charge had his best interests at heart. 2 minutes left. Arya's laptop had become a window into her own soul, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable truth about human nature that philosophers and psychologists had been exploring for centuries. How much money would it take to compromise your principles? How easily could ordinary people be manipulated into causing harm? She was becoming a case study in her own moral flexibility, and she didn't like what the data was revealing. Her phone buzzed with a text from the hospice facility. Her mother had asked for her 3 times during the evening, wondering when Arya would visit again. The guilt was a physical weight in her chest, pressing down on her lungs and making it hard to breathe. Eleanor Sage deserved better than a daughter who couldn't afford to save her life, who was so desperate that she was considering hurting strangers for money. 1 minute remaining. David closed his book and stretched, apparently finishing his reading session. He looked directly into the camera for a moment, and Arya felt like he could see straight through the screen into her anguished soul. His expression was patient and trusting, the look of someone who believed in the basic goodness of other people. In 30 seconds, she could betray that trust for the price of a nice dinner. The red button appeared on her screen with 15 seconds left on the countdown. It pulsed with the same hypnotic rhythm as her first night, demanding a decision that would define who she was willing to become. Arya's cursor hovered over it, her entire body shaking with the weight of the choice. 10 seconds. 5. Her mother's face flashed through her mind, followed immediately by David's trusting smile. She clicked. The man on the screen jerked violently, his face contorting in surprise and pain as electricity coursed through his body. For 5 eternal seconds, Arya watched the direct result of her choice play out in real time. David's agony was brief but genuine, his confusion and fear evident in every muscle of his face. When it ended, he sat breathing heavily, looking around the room with the bewildered expression of someone whose faith in the world had just been shaken. The screen went black except for a simple message: Task 1 complete. Compensation $100. Task 2 will arrive in 24 hours. Thank you for your participation. Below it, her bank account balance had increased by exactly $100. The money felt like blood money, each digit on the screen representing a piece of her humanity that she'd sold to the highest bidder. The second task arrived like clockwork, and this time Arya was ready with her laptop closed, sitting as far away from it as her tiny apartment would allow. But the notification sound seemed to come from everywhere at once: her phone, her smart TV, even the digital clock on her microwave. The Empathy Project had infiltrated every connected device in her home, turning her sanctuary into a surveillance network that demanded her attention. Task 2, The Innocent's Shame, appeared simultaneously on every screen. The video feed this time showed a teenage girl, maybe 17, sitting in what looked like a school counselor's office. She was fidgeting with her sleeves, occasionally wiping away tears, the picture of adolescent vulnerability. Her name was displayed as Madison Wells, and the accompanying text revealed she was struggling with anxiety and had finally worked up the courage to seek help. The instructions made Arya's blood run cold. Madison believes she's speaking confidentially to a counselor about her fears and insecurities. Press the button to broadcast her most embarrassing confession to her entire high school via the school's social media accounts. The post will be deleted after 24 hours, but screenshots are permanent. Compensation $500. Time limit 10 minutes. This was exponentially worse than the first task. David had experienced 5 seconds of physical pain, but Madison would face social humiliation that could follow her for years. Teenage cruelty was legendary in its creativity and persistence. One moment of vulnerability broadcast to hundreds of peers could destroy a young person's sense of self-worth and belonging at the most fragile stage of identity formation. Arya tried desperately to turn off every device in her apartment, but they wouldn't respond to her commands. The screens followed her like accusing eyes, showing Madison's tearful face from multiple angles. The girl was talking now, opening up about her deepest fears and insecurities to someone she trusted. Her words were muted, but her body language spoke volumes, the way she hunched her shoulders protectively, the nervous energy in her constantly moving hands, the hope mixed with terror in her eyes. The money from the first task sat in Arya's account like a tumor, growing more malignant with each passing hour. She'd tried to return it, donate it, do anything to cleanse herself of the guilt. But the banking system showed no record of where it had come from. It existed in a digital limbo, neither clean nor fully dirty, just like her conscience. $500. Enough to cover her mother's medication for a month, or her own rent, or the car repairs she'd been putting off for weeks. Arya found herself calculating how much financial stress this single payment could alleviate, even as her moral center screamed in horror at what she was considering. The first task had been a crack in her ethical foundation. This would be a complete structural collapse. Madison paused in her confession to accept a tissue from the off-camera counselor. Her smile was grateful and fragile, the expression of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden alone and was finally finding the courage to share it. In that moment, she looked younger than her 17 years, a child desperate for understanding and acceptance in a world that often provided neither. Arya thought about her own teenage years, the mortification of having her private journal read aloud in English class by a cruel substitute teacher, the weeks of mockery that had followed. That humiliation had been accidental and limited to 30 students. What she was being asked to do to Madison would be intentional and amplified by social media's unlimited reach. The digital age had turned teenage cruelty into a spectator sport with an audience of thousands. The countdown timer appeared. 7 minutes remaining. Madison was really opening up now, her posture becoming less defensive as she found her voice. Whatever she was sharing, it was clearly something she'd never told another person. Her vulnerability was beautiful and heartbreaking, the kind of authentic human moment that deserved protection, not exploitation. Arya's phone rang, cutting through her anguish like a knife. The hospice facility's number appeared on the screen, and her heart stopped. These calls never brought good news. She answered with shaking hands, dreading what she might hear. "Miss Sage, this is Dr. Rodriguez. Your mother has taken a turn for the worse. The infection isn't responding to treatment, and we need to discuss more aggressive options. The insurance company has denied coverage, but there are experimental treatments available if you can cover the costs. We're looking at approximately $45,000 for the full course." The number hit Arya like a physical blow. $45,000, almost exactly what the Empathy Project was offering for 5 tasks. The cosmic timing felt like a cruel joke, as if the universe was testing just how far she was willing to fall to save the person she loved most. "How long do we have to decide?" Arya asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The sooner we start, the better her chances. I'd recommend beginning treatment within the next few days if we're going to try." Arya hung up and stared at the screen surrounding her. Madison was still talking, still trusting, still unaware that her most private moments were being packaged for public consumption. 4 minutes remained on the countdown. The girl's future happiness balanced against her mother's life. It was a Sophie's choice designed by someone with a deep understanding of human psychology and a complete absence of conscience. She tried to imagine explaining to her mother's grave that she'd had the chance to save her but couldn't bring herself to hurt a stranger. Then she tried to imagine living with the knowledge that she'd destroyed a teenager's life for money. Both scenarios felt like death sentences for her soul. 2 minutes left. Madison had stopped crying and was actually smiling now, apparently having worked through whatever crisis had brought her to the counselor's office. Her transformation was remarkable, from broken and desperate to hopeful and empowered in the span of a single conversation. She looked like a different person, someone who had just discovered her own strength. The red button appeared with 30 seconds on the clock. Arya's hand moved toward her laptop trackpad with the jerky, involuntary motion of a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. Madison's face filled every screen in the apartment, her eyes bright with newfound confidence and trust in the adult world that was about to betray her in the most devastating way possible. 15 seconds. Arya thought about her mother's smile, her laugh, the way she hummed while cooking dinner. 10 seconds. She thought about Madison's future, the dreams that could be shattered, the trust that could be broken forever. 5 seconds. Her cursor hovered over the button as 2 lives hung in the balance. She clicked. Madison's confession exploded across social media feeds throughout her school. Within minutes, the first screenshots appeared, followed by comments that ranged from mocking to viciously cruel. Arya watched in real time as a young person's world disintegrated as hundreds of her peers turned her vulnerability into entertainment. The girl's phone started buzzing incessantly with notifications, each one another nail in the coffin of her social life. The screens went black, leaving only the completion message and a new bank balance $500 higher. But this time, there was an additional note. Your psychological profile suggests high empathy combined with financial desperation, an ideal combination for our purposes. Task 3 will test your limits further. Thank you for your continued participation. Task 3 shattered every boundary Arya thought she had left. The video feed showed a young mother, Sarah Kim, 26 years old, standing in her kitchen making breakfast for her 4-year-old daughter. The little girl sat at a small table, chattering happily about her upcoming first day of preschool, her face bright with innocent excitement. She was beautiful in the way all children are beautiful, unguarded, trusting, radiating pure joy at the simple pleasure of sharing pancakes with her mommy. Task 3, the mother's choice, read the instructions that appeared below the domestic scene. Sarah is a single mother working 2 jobs to support her daughter Emma. She has been selected to receive a fake child services investigation based on an anonymous tip claiming neglect. Press the button to trigger the investigation, which will result in Emma being temporarily removed from her mother's care while the false allegations are investigated. Standard processing time, 30 days minimum. Compensation, $2,500. Time limit, 15 minutes. Arya's laptop slipped from her numb fingers, clattering to the floor of her apartment. This wasn't about causing pain or embarrassment anymore. This was about destroying the fundamental bond between a mother and child. She knew enough about the child protective system to understand that once an investigation began, the bureaucratic machinery became unstoppable. Even false allegations could take months to resolve, and children could be lost in the system's labyrinthine procedures. Sarah lifted Emma onto the counter to help flip pancakes, both of them laughing as flour ended up in their hair. The little girl's giggle was like music, pure and unburdened by the cruel realities that awaited her in the world. She wrapped her small arms around her mother's neck, pressing kisses to Sarah's cheek with the generous affection that only children possessed. Sarah's face glowed with the fierce, protective love that defined motherhood at its most essential. The backstory provided with the task painted a picture of struggle and sacrifice that Arya recognized too well. Sarah worked nights at a diner and mornings cleaning office buildings to afford their small apartment. She dropped out of college when she got pregnant, choosing her child over her own dreams without a moment's hesitation. Every decision she made was filtered through the question of what was best for Emma, the kind of selfless devotion that society claimed to value but rarely supported practically. 15 minutes to decide whether to tear apart a family for money. Arya tried to leave her apartment, but found the door wouldn't open. The electronic lock had been overridden by the same system that controlled her devices. She was trapped in her own home, forced to confront this impossible choice without escape or distraction. The walls seemed to close in around her as the reality of her situation crystallized. She wasn't just participating in a psychological study anymore. She was being held captive by someone with the technological capability to control her environment completely. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from the hospice facility. When she finally answered, Dr. Rodriguez's voice was tight with urgency. "Miss Sage, we need your decision immediately. Your mother's condition is deteriorating rapidly, and if we don't begin the experimental treatment in the next 24 hours, she may not survive the week." "I need more time," Arya whispered, watching Sarah help Emma practice writing her name on a piece of paper covered in colorful crayon marks. "I'm sorry, but time is the one thing we don't have. The treatment facility has other patients waiting, and your mother's window of viability is closing fast. I need a commitment and payment authorization by tomorrow morning, or we'll have to focus on making her as comfortable as possible in her final days." The weight of those words, "final days," crashed down on Arya like a physical force. Her mother, who had sacrificed everything to give her daughter opportunities she'd never had, would die because Arya couldn't bring herself to cause pain to strangers. The moral calculus was becoming impossible to navigate. Was allowing her mother to die really more ethical than destroying other people's lives to save her? On the screen, Emma was showing her mother a drawing she'd made of their family, 2 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun and a house with crooked windows. "That's you and me, Mommy," she said with the serious pride of a young artist. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she praised the artwork, promising to hang it on the refrigerator where everyone could see it. 10 minutes remaining. Arya began to pace her small apartment like a caged animal, her mind racing through possibilities and justifications. Maybe Sarah was stronger than she looked. Maybe the investigation would be resolved quickly. Maybe temporary separation would be better than growing up in poverty. Each rationalization felt more hollow than the last, transparent attempts to make the unthinkable seem reasonable. The Empathy Project had chosen its victims with surgical precision. David had been middle-aged and resilient, someone who could recover from a brief shock. Madison had been a teenager with years ahead of her to rebuild her reputation. But Sarah and Emma represented the most sacred bond in human experience, the relationship between mother and child that formed the foundation of psychological security and emotional development. 5 minutes left. Sarah was braiding Emma's hair now, the little girl chattering about her teacher and the other children she hoped to meet. Her excitement was infectious and heartbreaking, the anticipation of someone on the cusp of a new adventure. In 30 days, if Arya pressed the button, this same child would be confused and traumatized, wondering why the adults who were supposed to protect her had taken her away from the only home she'd ever known. Arya's bank account showed $600 from the previous tasks. Adding $2,500 would bring her total to $3,100, still nowhere near the $45,000 needed for her mother's treatment. She would have to complete all 5 tasks to have any hope of saving Eleanor's life, which meant there were still 2 more moral boundaries waiting to be crossed. Each task was worse than the last, escalating in psychological impact like a carefully designed torture program. 2 minutes remaining. Emma had finished breakfast and was now playing with toy cars on the kitchen floor while Sarah cleaned dishes. The domestic tableau was achingly normal, a snapshot of the ordinary moments that comprised a life lived in love and mutual dependence. This was what families looked like when they functioned properly, not perfect, but bound together by care and commitment and the simple pleasure of sharing space and time. The red button appeared with 30 seconds on the countdown. Arya's hand shook as she reached for her laptop, every fiber of her being screaming in protest against what she was about to do. Sarah bent down to kiss Emma's forehead, and the little girl looked up with absolute adoration, secure in the knowledge that her mother would always be there to protect her. 20 seconds. Arya thought about her own childhood, the security of knowing her mother would move heaven and earth to keep her safe. 15 seconds. She thought about Eleanor lying in a hospital bed, trusting that her daughter would find a way to save her. 10 seconds. 2 mothers, 2 daughters, 2 impossible choices. She pressed the button. Within hours, Child Protective Services arrived at Sarah's apartment. Arya watched through hidden cameras as the young mother's world collapsed in real time. Emma cried and reached for Sarah as strangers carried her away, her small voice calling, "Mommy, Mommy," until she disappeared from view. Sarah collapsed on her kitchen floor, surrounded by the remnants of their interrupted breakfast, her sobs echoing through the apartment that suddenly felt cavernous in its emptiness. The completion message was brief. Task 3 complete. Compensation, $2,500. Your total earnings, $3,100. Task 4 will arrive in 24 hours. The final task will test everything you believe about yourself. Prepare accordingly. The last task arrived as Arya sat in her mother's hospital room, holding Eleanor's frail hand while machines beeped rhythmically around them. The experimental treatment had been approved and was ready to begin, but Dr. Rodriguez needed the payment authorization within the next 6 hours. Eleanor stirred in her sleep, her face gaunt but peaceful, trusting her daughter to make the right choices even in her dreams. The laptop screen flickered to life without Arya touching it, displaying the final video feed. This time, the subject was achingly familiar. It was Arya herself, but the recording was from 3 days ago. before she'd clicked the red button for the first time. The pre-experiment version of herself sat in her apartment, looking tired but fundamentally intact, still possessing something that the current Arya had lost forever. Task 5. The Mirror's Truth. Read the instructions that appeared below her own image. You are looking at yourself from 96 hours ago, before you began this experiment. This version of you still believes in absolute moral boundaries, still thinks she could never harm innocent people for money. Press the button to send her a message that will prevent her from ever starting this journey. The message will create a temporal paradox that erases everything you've done, returning all victims to their original states, but also preventing your mother's treatment from being funded. Compensation: $41,900, bringing your total to exactly $45,000. Time limit: 30 minutes. Choose wisely, this decision cannot be undone. Arya's mind reeled as she tried to process the impossible choice before her. The Empathy Project's final task wasn't about hurting another stranger. It was about confronting the person she used to be and deciding whether to sacrifice her mother's life to undo the damage she'd caused to others. It was the ultimate psychological experiment, forcing her to weigh the value of her mother's life against the collective harm she'd inflicted on David, Madison, Sarah, and Emma. The past version of herself on the screen looked so innocent, so certain of her own moral strength. That Arya had never shocked a stranger, never ruined a teenager's reputation, never torn apart a family. She still believed in the absolute nature of right and wrong, still thought there were lines that decent people simply didn't cross. The contrast was devastating. 3 days had transformed her from someone who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries into someone who destroyed families for money. Eleanor stirred again, her eyes fluttering open to focus on her daughter's face. "Arya, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the machines. "You look troubled." "What's wrong?" "Nothing, Mom, just tired." The lie came easily now. Another small corruption in a soul that had been methodically poisoned over 4 days of moral compromise. "The doctors say the treatment is ready to start. You're going to get better." Eleanor's smile was radiant despite her weakness. "I knew you'd find a way. You're so strong, just like your father was. He would be so proud of the woman you've become." The words were like acid in Arya's chest. Her father had been a man of unshakable principles, someone who had once returned a wallet containing thousands of dollars to a stranger without ever considering keeping it. He'd taught her that character was defined by what you did when no one was watching, that the measure of a person was how they treated those who couldn't help them in return. If he could see what she'd become, pride would be the last thing he'd feel. 25 minutes remaining. On the screen, her past self was reading the first email from the Empathy Project, her face showing the same mix of curiosity and apprehension that had ultimately led to her downfall. This was the moment when everything had begun to unravel, when desperation had first whispered that maybe, just maybe, the ends could justify any means necessary. Arya thought about David Chun, probably still feeling phantom pains from the shock she delivered 3 days ago. She thought about Madison Wells, who had likely changed schools by now to escape the ongoing harassment from her leaked confession. Most of all, she thought about little Emma Kim, confused and frightened in a foster home, asking strangers when her mommy was coming to get her. These were real people with real lives that had been permanently altered by her choices. The temporal mechanics of the final task didn't make logical sense, but nothing about the empathy project had followed conventional rules of reality. Somehow they had the ability to reach backward through time to undo the cascade of harm that had started with a single click on a red button. All the pain she'd caused could be erased, all the victims restored to their original states of innocence and happiness. But the cost would be her mother's life. 15 minutes left. Elena had drifted back to sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. The experimental treatment offered a 70% chance of full recovery, according to Dr. Rodriguez. Without it, she had perhaps a week left to live. Arya tried to imagine attending her mother's funeral, knowing she'd had the power to save her, but had chosen strangers over the woman who'd given her life meaning and purpose. The moral calculus was impossibly complex. Was one life worth more than 4? Was the bond between mother and daughter more sacred than the bond she'd severed between other families? Could she live with either choice, knowing that people would suffer regardless of what she decided? Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We've been watching your progress with great interest. Your psychological profile suggests you'll make the utilitarian choice, sacrificing one for the many. But remember, your mother chose to sacrifice for you every day of your childhood. Perhaps it's time to return the favor." The message deleted itself immediately after she read it. Another reminder of the technological omnipresence that had controlled every aspect of the experiment. The empathy project knew her better than she knew herself, had predicted her moral breakdown with scientific precision. They'd crafted each task to exploit her specific vulnerabilities, leading her step by step toward this final impossible moment. 10 minutes remaining. Arya looked at her reflection in the black screen of her phone, seeing a stranger's face staring back at her. The woman in the reflection had hollow eyes and sharp cheekbones, carved by guilt and sleepless nights. This was what moral compromise looked like, not a sudden transformation, but a gradual erosion of everything that had once defined her as human. The past version of herself on the laptop screen was closing the first email, preparing to delete it for what she thought would be the final time. In moments, that innocent woman would make the decision that would damn them both, clicking a button that seemed so harmless but opened the door to horrors she couldn't imagine. Arya had the power to save her from that fate, to preserve the person she used to be. 5 minutes left. Eleanor's hand felt impossibly fragile in hers, like holding a bird with hollow bones. Her mother had worked 3 jobs to put her through college, had missed countless social events and personal opportunities to ensure her daughter had every advantage. Eleanor Sage had been the kind of mother who stayed up all night when Arya had the flu, who drove across town to bring forgotten homework to school, who celebrated every small victory as if it were a Nobel Prize. The countdown reached 3 minutes. Arya's cursor hovered over the red button one final time, her hand shaking with the magnitude of the choice before her. press the button and become someone who could live with the knowledge that she'd sacrificed her mother to undo her own mistakes. Don't press it and remain someone who had destroyed innocent lives to save the person she loved most. 2 minutes. The machines around Eleanor's bed continued their rhythmic beeping, marking time like a metronome, counting down to either salvation or damnation. Arya thought about Emma Kim's drawing of her family, probably crumpled in a trash can somewhere after being torn down from a refrigerator in an empty apartment. She thought about Madison Wells, learning to trust no one with her secrets ever again. She thought about David Chun, wondering if the world was really as safe and predictable as he'd once believed. 1 minute remaining. Arya closed her eyes and made her choice, not the utilitarian calculation that would minimize overall suffering, and not the selfish decision that would prioritize her own needs above all else. Instead, she chose to accept responsibility for what she'd become, to live with the consequences of her actions rather than erasing them from existence. She didn't press the button. The screen went black as the countdown reached 0, leaving only a final message. Experiment concluded. Total compensation forfeited due to incomplete participation, $0. All previous payments have been reversed. Thank you for revealing the true depths of human moral flexibility. Your psychological profile has been invaluable for our research. Arya's bank account showed its original balance. The money had never been real, just numbers on a screen designed to make her believe she was earning something valuable through her degradation. The victims of her choices, however, were entirely real, and their suffering would continue long after the experiment ended. Dr. Rodriguez appeared in the doorway, his expression grave. Miss Sage, I need your decision about the treatment. We can't wait any longer. Arya looked at her mother's peaceful face one more time, then stood and walked to the window overlooking the city below. Somewhere out there, David was probably having trouble trusting medical researchers. Madison was learning to build walls around her heart. Sarah was fighting the legal system to get her daughter back. Emma was asking strangers when her mommy was coming home. We can't afford the treatment, Arya said finally, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. We'll focus on making her comfortable. Eleanor died 3 days later, holding her daughter's hand as the sun set outside her hospital window. Her last words were an expression of pride in the woman Arya had become, a final irony in a story built on moral inversions and impossible choices. At the funeral, Arya stood alone beside her mother's grave and made a promise to the woman who had taught her the difference between right and wrong. She would spend whatever time remained of her life trying to undo the damage she'd caused, helping the people she'd hurt, becoming someone worthy of Eleanor Sage's final words of pride. The Empathy Project had succeeded in its mission. It had mapped the precise boundaries of human moral flexibility and documented how ordinary people could be manipulated into causing extraordinary harm. But it had also created something its designers hadn't anticipated, a person who understood the true cost of compromise and was willing to pay any price to reclaim her humanity. As Arya walked away from the cemetery, she carried with her the weight of every choice she'd made and the determination to ensure that her mother's death would not be meaningless. The experiment was over, but the real test of who she was willing to become was just beginning. The red button had revealed the darkness that lived inside everyone, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. But darkness, once acknowledged, could also be transformed into the light that guided others away from the same path. Arya Sage would spend the rest of her life proving that redemption was possible, even for those who had lost themselves in the maze of moral compromise. Her mother had taught her that character was defined by what you did when no one was watching. Now, with the whole world watching, it was time to show what that character was truly made of. Don't let this story end here. If you found yourself questioning what you would do in Arya's situation, you're not alone. Human psychology and moral decision-making are complex topics that affect us all. Share this story with friends and family. Start conversations about ethics, empathy, and the choices we make when desperate. Subscribe for more psychological thrillers that will challenge your assumptions about right and wrong. Comment below. Would you have made the same choices as Arya? What would it take to compromise your own moral boundaries? Your engagement helps these important conversations reach more people who need to hear them.